It was just past 10 at night when he pushed open the heavy backstage door of the Evergreen Performing Arts Center, the kind of building that seemed to hold its breath between shows. The air inside smelled like old wood, rosin, and the faintest hint of perfume left behind by performers who'd strutted across that stage hours earlier. He didn't mind the quiet. In fact, he preferred it. Out there in the real world, everything moved too fast. Bills piled up, school forms needed signing. His youngest still cried at night calling for someone who wouldn't answer. But here in the hush of the empty theater, time slowed down, just enough to catch his breath. He grabbed his broom from the supply closet, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and started at the back of the auditorium. Rows of red velvet seats stretched upward like a silent audience waiting for something to happen. He swept slowly, methodically, letting the soft swish of bristles against carpet fill the space. It wasn't glamorous work. It never had been. But it paid the rent, covered groceries, and kept the lights on in their small apartment 3 bus rides away. That was enough. More than enough, really, considering how close things had come to falling apart 2 years ago. Back then, life had felt like a symphony, full of rhythm, harmony, and promise. He'd studied piano at a respected conservatory, not because he wanted fame, but because music made sense to him in a way words never could. He could sit at a keyboard for hours, lost in scales and sonatas, feeling like he was speaking a language only his soul understood. Then he met her. She wasn't a musician, but she loved listening. She'd sit cross-legged on the floor of their tiny apartment, eyes closed, smiling as he played. "You make the piano sing," she once told him. And for a while it did. They built a life together, modest but warm. 2 daughters came along, one after the other, each with her mother's laugh and his quiet eyes. He'd stopped performing publicly by then, choosing instead to teach beginner lessons at a community center and take odd jobs to make ends meet. Music became something he shared at bedtime, soft lullabies on an old upright piano in the corner of their living room, fingers dancing over yellowed keys while his girls drifted off to sleep. Then, without warning, everything changed. It started with a cough. Just a cough, then fatigue, then hospital visits that turned into weeks. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. Cancer, aggressive and swift. She was gone before spring even arrived. The world didn't stop. Bills still came. The girls still needed breakfast, socks, hugs. But something inside him did stop. Not completely, but enough. He packed away the sheet music, stopped tuning the piano, couldn't bear to hear those familiar melodies without her in the room. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like a blanket soaked in rain. To keep going, he took the night janitor job at the arts center. It was steady, anonymous. No one asked how he was doing. No one expected him to smile. He'd arrive after tucking his daughters in, kiss their foreheads one last time, whisper, "Daddy's just going to work," and slip out into the cool night. His older girl, 8 now, had started helping with her little sister, making sure she brushed her teeth, picking out her pajamas. She never complained, but sometimes when he came home just before dawn, he'd find her asleep on the couch, still in her school clothes, waiting up. That broke him more than any bill ever could. Tonight, like most nights, he worked alone. The stage lights were off, but moonlight spilled through the high windows, casting long silver rectangles across the polished floor. As he moved toward the front of the hall, broom in hand, he passed the grand piano. Center stage, lid open, gleaming under the emergency exit sign's soft green glow. He always paused there. Not because he wanted to play, he told himself he didn't, but because it felt like visiting an old friend he wasn't sure he deserved to talk to anymore. He remembered the first time he'd seen that piano. He'd been delivering cleaning supplies during the day before he officially started the job. A rehearsal was happening, a young pianist practicing Rachmaninoff. The sound had filled the hall like thunder and rain, powerful and aching. He'd stood in the wings unnoticed, heart pounding. That night he dreamed of playing again. But when he woke up, the dream felt like a betrayal. How could he enjoy music when she couldn't hear it? Still, his hands remembered. Even now, as he swept, his fingers twitched slightly, index finger lifting as if pressing a high C, thumb curling like it was resting on middle C. Muscle memory was a stubborn thing. It didn't care about grief. It just remembered. He finished the main floor and climbed the steps to the stage. Up close, the piano looked even more majestic. German-made, over 100 years old, lovingly maintained. He ran a hand along its smooth black surface, careful not to leave a smudge. Then, almost without thinking, he lifted the fallboard and pressed a single key. Middle C. The note rang out, clear and warm, bouncing off the walls, filling the empty space like a voice finally speaking after years of silence. He jerked his hand back as if burned. "Don't," he whispered to himself. "Not here. Not now." But the sound lingered in the air and in his chest. For a moment he stood there staring at the keys, caught between longing and fear. What if he sat down? Just for a minute? No one was around. The building was locked. The security cameras didn't cover the stage during off hours. He could play one piece, just one, something simple. No one would ever know. Then he pictured his youngest daughter's face in the morning, tired, maybe cranky, needing him to make pancakes and tie her shoes. He saw his older girl trying to do homework at the kitchen table while watching cartoons for her sister. He thought of the rent due next week, the leaky faucet he still hadn't fixed, the way his shoes were starting to split at the seams. This wasn't the time for dreams. This was the time for brooms and bleach and making sure his girls had clean socks. He closed the piano lid gently, like tucking in a child, and went back to sweeping. But the note middle C echoed in his mind all the same. Outside, the city hummed. Cars passed on the wet streets. Somewhere, a siren wailed. But inside the theater, it was quiet again. Just the soft scratch of bristles, the shuffle of worn sneakers, and the quiet rhythm of a man doing what he had to do. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 24 hours, everything would change. He'd been offered a chance once before, right after she passed. A local theater needed a last-minute fill-in for a benefit concert. He'd said no, too soon, too painful, too much like pretending life could go back to normal. But tonight, as he swept the last row and turned off the aisle lights one by one, something felt different. Not hopeful exactly, but open, like a window cracked just enough to let in a breeze. He locked up the auditorium, checked the backstage doors, and walked down the long corridor toward the employee exit. His shift was over. Time to go home. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. The bus wouldn't come for another 20 minutes. He sat on the bench under the flickering street lamp, watching his breath form little clouds in the air. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. A text from his older daughter. "Did you finish work? Lily won't sleep without your voice." He smiled, a small, tired thing, and typed back, "On my way. Tell her Daddy's coming with stories and sleepy songs." He didn't mention the piano. Didn't mention the note he'd played. Some things were too fragile to share, even with the people you loved most. But as the bus rumbled toward him down the empty street, headlights cutting through the dark, he found himself humming a tune he hadn't thought of in years. It was a simple melody, one he used to play for his wife on quiet Sunday mornings. Just a few notes. Nothing fancy, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt to remember. He boarded the bus, found a seat by the window, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, never really slept on the ride home, but to listen. To the engine's rumble, the occasional cough from another passenger, the distant sound of a saxophone from a late-night club down the block, and beneath it all, faint but steady, the echo of Middle C. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow night, he wouldn't be holding a broom. He'd be holding the attention of a room full of strangers, and they would listen, not to the man in the janitor's uniform, but to the music he'd kept locked away for far too long. The next day started like most others, early, tired, and full of small emergencies. His youngest woke up with a stuffy nose, rubbing her eyes and calling for him before the sun had even cleared the rooftops. He made oatmeal, checked her temperature, normal, thank goodness, and helped her pick out socks that matched, well, close enough. His older daughter was already dressed, backpack ready, quietly packing extra tissues for her sister, just in case. She didn't say much, but the way she tucked a favorite stuffed rabbit into the lunchbox told him everything. She was trying to be the grown-up now, too. He walked them to school, holding one small hand in each of his, their chatter filling the crisp morning air. They talked about a class play, a lost crayon, the way the cafeteria served mystery meat on Tuesdays. Normal kid stuff, the kind of talk that used to feel ordinary, but now felt like tiny miracles. When they reached the school gate, His older daughter turned and hugged him tight, longer than usual. "You look tired, Daddy," she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "Just a long night. I'll be okay." Back home, he collapsed onto the couch for 20 minutes, just enough to close his eyes, not enough to fall asleep. Then it was laundry, dishes, a quick trip to the corner store for milk and bread, and fixing that leaky kitchen faucet with a wrench he'd borrowed from a neighbor. By mid-afternoon, the apartment felt quiet again, clean in that temporary way that never lasted past bedtime. He sat at the small kitchen table, sipping weak coffee, staring at the piano in the corner. It hadn't been touched in months. Dust gathered on the lid. A few picture frames sat on top, family photos from before. He didn't look at them directly, just let them exist in his peripheral vision, like ghosts he'd learned to live with. He didn't plan to go back to the arts center early. His shift didn't start until 9, but something pulled him there. Maybe it was the memory of that single note from last night. Maybe it was the way his fingers kept tapping rhythms on the table. Or maybe it was just that the apartment felt too still, too full of silence he couldn't fill. He left just after 6, telling himself he'd only check the supply closet, make sure they had enough floor cleaner for the weekend shows. But when he arrived, the building was already buzzing. Cars lined the street. Valets in crisp uniforms darted between luxury sedans. Women in glittering dresses and men in tuxedos streamed through the front doors laughing, taking photos, clutching programs like prized possessions. He slipped in through the service entrance, head down, uniform already on under his jacket. No one noticed him. That was how it always was. Inside, the usual calm had vanished. Stagehands rushed past with cables and mic stands. Caterers wheeled in trays of hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet tuned their instruments in the green room. He kept to the shadows, heading for the storage area, but the theater manager, a wiry man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and a voice that always sounded like he'd just run a marathon, spotted him near the loading dock. "There you are," the manager said, grabbing his arm. "Thank God, I was about to call you." He blinked. "My shift doesn't start for hours." I know, the man said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But something's happened. Big problem. The pianist, Anton Varga? You know, the one headlining tonight's gala? He's not coming. What happened? Food poisoning. Or maybe it was stress. His assistant just called. He's in the hospital. Can't even stand up. And the show starts in," he checked his watch, 32 minutes. The manager's eyes darted around like he was searching for a solution in the air. "We've got 600 people out there, donors, city officials. The mayor's wife is sitting in the 3rd row. This is a charity thing for the children's hospital. If we cancel, we lose half our annual funding." He didn't say anything, just stood there, broom still in hand, feeling the weight of the man's panic like a physical thing. Then the manager looked at him, really looked, and his expression shifted. "Wait, you used to play, right? Back in the day? I saw your resume when you applied. Conservatory training?" He shook his head quickly. "That was a long time ago. I haven't played in years, but you can play? I guess. But not like that. Not for a crowd like this." The manager's voice dropped, almost pleading. "I'm not asking for a full concert. Just 10 minutes, anything, a few pieces. Keep the audience calm while we figure out what to do. Maybe someone from the orchestra can fill in later. But right now we need sound. We need music. Or this whole night falls apart." He opened his mouth to say no, to say he wasn't ready, to say he hadn't touched a real piano since before. But then he thought of his daughters, of the school trip his older one had been talking about, the one that cost extra, of the dentist appointment his youngest needed, of the way his older girl had hugged him that morning like she was holding him together, and then, quieter but stronger, he thought of her. The one who used to sit on the floor and listen. The one who believed music could heal. He swallowed hard. "What would I play?" "Whatever you know. Whatever feels right." He looked toward the stage. The grand piano sat there waiting, the same one he'd touched last night. It looked different now, lit by warm stage lights, surrounded by velvet curtains like it belonged to another world. A world he'd left behind. "I'll need a few minutes alone with it," he said quietly. The manager's face lit up. "Yes, of course. Take the stage. I'll hold the curtain. Just be ready in 10. He walked slowly toward the steps, heart hammering so loud he was sure the manager could hear it. His hands were damp. His knees felt weak. He hadn't been this nervous since his first recital at 16. Backstage he paused, took a deep breath, tried to steady himself. But his mind raced. What if he forgot the notes? What if his fingers froze? What if they laughed? He wasn't dressed for this. He was wearing his janitor's shirt, faded blue with a small coffee stain near the pocket. His shoes were scuffed. His hair was messy from the wind outside. But then he remembered something his old piano teacher used to say. The music isn't in your clothes. It's in your hands. And your heart. He stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, hotter than he remembered. He could see the empty seats stretching out before him, red and plush, waiting. He walked to the piano, sat down, adjusted the bench. His fingers hovered over the keys. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just silence. His own breathing. The distant hum of the building. Then, without thinking, he placed his right hand on the keys and played the opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was the first piece he'd ever learned by heart. The one he'd played for her on their first anniversary. The one she'd hummed in her sleep sometimes. The notes came out softer than he expected, tentative like a question. But then his left hand joined in and something shifted. The music began to flow, not perfectly, but honestly. He wasn't playing for an audience. He was playing for her, for his girls, for the man he used to be and the one he was trying to become again. Time blurred. He didn't notice the stagehand peeking from the wings. Didn't hear the manager whispering into a headset. Didn't feel the sweat on his brow. He just played. When he finished the first phrase, he stopped. Looked up. The stage was still empty. But he knew they were coming. Soon the doors would open. People would file in. And he'd be sitting there in his work clothes, unannounced, unexpected. Fear crept back in. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should just get up and leave. Go back to sweeping. That was safe. That was known. But then he thought of his youngest daughter's voice on the phone last night. Daddy's coming with stories and sleepy songs. He wasn't just a janitor. He was a father. A husband once. A musician still somewhere deep down. He took another breath. Placed his hands back on the keys. This time he played louder. Clearer. Let the music fill the space, not as an apology, but as a presence. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. He lost count. He played a Bach prelude, then a simple folk melody his grandmother used to sing. Nothing flashy. Nothing showy. Just music that meant something to him. Then he heard it. The murmur of voices outside. The rustle of programs. The soft clink of champagne glasses. They were coming. He stopped playing. Sat very still. His heart pounded like a drum. The manager appeared at the edge of the stage, gave him a quick thumbs up and whispered, "You're on in 2." He nodded, wiped his palms on his pants, stared at the piano like it might offer advice. The lights in the auditorium dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. Then the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, tonight's featured performer is unable to join us. However, we are honored to present a special opening performance by a member of our evergreen family." There was a pause. Confused murmurs rippled through the audience. Then the spotlight hit him. He stood up slowly, brushed off his shirt, and walked to the front of the stage. He didn't bow, didn't smile, just turned, sat back down, and placed his hands on the keys. For a second, the room was silent. Then someone in the back row whispered, "Is that the janitor?" He heard it. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he began to play. Not the Chopin this time. Something deeper. Something raw. A piece he'd never performed before. A melody he'd written himself years ago during a sleepless night after she got sick. It had no name. Just notes that ached and hoped and remembered. And as the first chords filled the hall, something unexpected happened. The whispering stopped. The rustling stopped. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the keys, fingers moving with a certainty he didn't know he still had. The music wasn't perfect. There was a missed note here, a shaky phrase there, but it was true. And truth, he was learning, mattered more than perfection. Back in the wings, the manager stood frozen, hand over his mouth. He hadn't expected this. Not even close. In the third row, the mayor's wife dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and somewhere in the middle, a little girl leaned over to her mother and whispered, "He sounds like my daddy when he sings to me." But he didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was the piano beneath his hands, the weight of memory in every chord and the quiet courage it took to let his heart speak, after so long of keeping it locked away. He played for 10 minutes, then 12, then 15. No one asked him to stop. No one clapped early. They just listened. And in that moment, sweeping floors and stained uniforms didn't matter. All that mattered was the music, and the man who finally let it out. The first note hung in the air like a single drop of rain before a storm, soft, clear, and full of something no one in the room could name yet. But they felt it all the same. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the keys, fingers resting lightly as if afraid they might vanish if he moved too fast. Then came the second note and the third, and soon the melody unfolded like a letter finally being read after years tucked away in a drawer. He played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece he'd practiced 1,000 times in college, the same one he'd played for her on their first real date, back when coffee shops were their idea of a fancy night out and dreams still felt light enough to carry. His hands remembered the phrasing, the gentle swell of emotion in the middle section, the way the left hand should cradle the right like a promise. But now there was something else woven into it, something deeper, rougher, realer. Grief, yes, but also love. Not the kind that fades, but the kind that stays even when the person is gone. At first, the audience didn't know what to do. They'd come dressed in silken tuxedos, expecting polished perfection from a world-renowned artist. Instead, they got a man in a faded blue work shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with faint scars from old burns and scrapes, evidence of a life lived not on stages, but in kitchens, hallways, bus stops, and late-night worries. Some exchanged glances. A few frowned. One woman near the front even leaned over to her companion and whispered, "Is this a joke?" But then the music changed. It wasn't just notes anymore. It was a story. You could hear the quiet mornings, the empty chair at the table, the way a father's voice cracks when he tucks his child in and says, "Sweet dreams," even though his own dreams are full of ghosts. You could hear the struggle, the weight of bills, the exhaustion of double shifts, the loneliness that doesn't announce itself but settles in your bones like winter damp. And underneath it all, a stubborn thread of hope. Not loud or flashy, but steady, like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. The frowns softened. The whispers died. Even the woman who'd questioned the performance now sat very still, her gloved hands folded in her lap, eyes glistening. He didn't notice. He was somewhere else entirely, back in that tiny apartment playing for two little girls who believed their daddy could do anything. Back in the hospital room, holding a hand that grew colder by the hour. Back at the conservatory, young and full of fire, believing music could fix the world. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't trying to impress. He was just telling the truth. And sometimes truth is the most beautiful thing you'll ever hear. Halfway through the piece, his left hand stumbled, just for a second, on a tricky run. A tiny mistake. In a normal concert, it might have drawn a critical ear, but here, in this moment, it did the opposite. It made him human. And that humanity was what the room needed, even if they didn't know it yet. A little girl in the front row, couldn't have been more than 6, leaned forward in her seat, chin resting on the back of the chair in front of her. She didn't fidget, didn't ask for candy, just watched his hands move over the keys like they were magic. When the melody swelled into its most tender passage, she turned to her mother and whispered so softly only the people nearby could hear, "He sounds like my daddy when he sings to me." Her mother didn't answer. She just reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, tears already spilling down her cheeks. Backstage, the theater manager stood frozen in the wings, one hand gripping the velvet curtain so tightly his knuckles turned white. He'd expected filler music, something simple to buy time. Maybe a few scales, a folk tune, anything to keep the crowd from getting restless. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to feel like someone had reached into his chest and gently squeezed his heart. He glanced at his watch. 20 minutes had passed. The backup plan, calling a local music student, was long forgotten. No one wanted a replacement now. They wanted him. On stage, he finished the Chopin and didn't stop. Without a word, without even lifting his hands from the keys, he began another piece, this one slower, simpler. It was a lullaby his grandmother used to hum when he was small, a tune with no written score, passed down through generations by ear. He'd played it for his daughters every night since they were babies. Now he played it for 600 strangers, and somehow it felt like he was playing it for all of them. For every parent who'd ever rocked a crying child. For every person who'd lost someone and still got up the next morning. For everyone who carried love like a secret weight. The room was utterly silent now. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for applause, but the deep, breathless quiet of people who've just heard something that matters. When the last note faded, he let his hands rest on the keys. He still didn't look up. He was afraid that if he saw their faces, he'd break. That the dam he'd built so carefully over 2 years would crack open right there on stage. But then it happened. One person clapped. Just one. A man in the balcony standing slowly, eyes red. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet. Not the quick automatic standing ovation some concerts get out of habit, but a real one. Raw, emotional. People weren't just clapping. They were crying, hugging each other, wiping their eyes with the backs of their hands. Someone in the back shouted, "Thank you." Not loud, but full of feeling. He finally looked up and froze. Rows and rows of people standing, applauding, some openly weeping. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real. Because in a world full of filters and facades, he'd shown up exactly as he was. Tired, grieving, working class, and still full of music. His throat tightened. He stood slowly, brushed his shirt again, useless since it was still wrinkled and stained, and gave a small, awkward bow. Not the elegant dip of a seasoned performer, but the humble nod of a man who never expected to be seen at all. Then he turned and walked off stage as quickly as he could, heart pounding like he'd just run a mile. Back in the wings, the manager rushed over, eyes wide. I don't even have words. You have to stay. The whole night is yours now. We'll cancel the rest of the program. Just play more. He shook his head. I can't. Why not? You just moved an entire room to tears. Because, he said quietly, I've got to get home to my girls. The manager stared at him, confused at first. Then understanding dawned. He nodded slowly. Right, of course. But before he could slip away, a woman in an elegant emerald dress approached from the side entrance. She looked familiar, local news anchor maybe. She held out a small recorder. Can I ask you a few questions? Who are you? How long have you played? What inspired that performance? He stepped back. I'm just the janitor. I clean this place. That's all. But you're clearly more than that. He looked down at his hands, calloused, nicked, still trembling slightly from adrenaline. Not really. I used to play. A long time ago, tonight. It just felt like the right time to remember. She pressed gently. Will you play again? He thought of his daughters waiting at home, probably already in pajamas, wondering when Daddy would walk through the door. He thought of the rent due next week, the broken toaster, the way his youngest still slept with the light on. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe, if it feels right. He didn't give his name. Didn't pose for photos. Just nodded politely, grabbed his broom from where he'd left it near the stage stairs, and walked out through the service entrance into the cool night air. The city was quiet. Rain had started to fall, soft, misty drops that clung to his hair and jacket. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. His hands still buzzed with the echo of the piano. His heart still raced. But beneath the adrenaline, something else stirred, peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being fixed, but the kind that comes from being honest. He walked to the bus stop, broom in hand, and sat on the wet bench. A few people passing by gave him curious looks. Janitor's uniform, broom coming out of a fancy theater at night. He didn't care. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his older daughter. Did you finish work? Lily won't sleep without your voice, he smiled. Typed back, almost home. Tell her Daddy's bringing a new lullaby. As he waited for the bus, he hummed the melody he'd played on stage, the one his grandmother taught him. It felt different now. Lighter. Like it wasn't just a memory anymore, but a gift he could pass on. He didn't know it yet, but someone in the audience had recorded the whole thing on their phone. By morning, the video would be shared online with the caption, Janitor steps in last minute, leaves entire audience in tears. It would get thousands of views by noon, by evening millions, but none of that mattered right now. Right now, all that mattered was getting home, kissing his girls goodnight, and maybe, just maybe, sitting at that old upright piano in the corner and playing one more song, just for them. Because music wasn't about concert halls or fancy dresses or perfect performances. It was about connection. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, he'd finally let himself connect, not just with the piano, but with the world again. The night of the Unity Gala arrived wrapped in autumn chill and city lights. Cars lined the boulevard outside the Evergreen Performing Arts Center, but this time he didn't slip in through the service entrance. He walked through the front doors, still in simple clothes, still without a tuxedo, but with his daughters on either side of him, each holding one of his hands like they were walking into a fairy tale. They wore matching dresses their school had helped pick out, donated by a local boutique after someone saw the video. His older girl kept smoothing her skirt, eyes wide with wonder. His youngest kept whispering, "Is that our piano, Daddy?" every time they passed a grand piano in a hotel lobby or store window. Tonight it would be their piano, the one on stage. He hadn't wanted to do this at first. The idea of performing again, under bright lights with cameras and dignitaries and expectations, made his stomach twist. But then he thought about the foundation he'd chosen, a small nonprofit that helped single parents who'd lost a partner, offering emergency rent help, counseling, and after-school care so kids wouldn't fall through the cracks. The money from tonight would keep it running for another year, maybe more, and that mattered more than his fear. Besides, his girls had begged. "Please, Daddy," his older one had said, eyes serious beyond her years. "Let us see you play like in the video." He couldn't say no to that. Backstage now, he wasn't alone. A stagehand handed him a cup of warm tea. The theater manager clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got this," he said, voice thick with pride. No one called him the janitor anymore, not out loud anyway. They called him by his name, or sometimes just the pianist. But he still signed in at the start of every shift, still swept the aisles on quiet nights, still fixed the leaky sink in the green room when no one else noticed. He refused to let the attention change that. Dignity, he'd learned, wasn't about what you did on stage. It was about showing up for your life, day after day, even when no one's watching. His daughters sat in the front row now, right in the center, legs swinging just above the floor. A volunteer from the foundation had brought them programs with their names written on the cover in glitter pen. They looked tiny in the sea of elegant guests, but they held their heads high, like they knew they belonged there. Because they did. This night was as much theirs as it was his. When his name was called, just his first name, no title, no fanfare, he walked onto the stage slowly. No rush, no pretense. The spotlight found him, but he didn't flinch. He nodded to the audience, not with showmanship, but with quiet respect. Then he sat at the piano. He didn't start with Chopin this time. He didn't play anything famous. Instead, he placed his hands on the keys and began a piece he'd written himself over the past few weeks. A melody that started soft and searching, like footsteps in an empty house, then grew warmer, fuller, like arms opening after a long absence. He'd titled it simply, "For Elena." Not for the crowd, not for the cameras, for her, for the woman who'd believed in him when no one else did, who'd danced in the kitchen to his off-key humming, who'd held his hand through every doubt. As he played, he didn't think about technique or timing. He thought about mornings making breakfast with one eye on the clock, nights reading bedtime stories with a voice rough from exhaustion, weekends spent mending toys and patching holes in socks. He thought about grief, not as a wall, but as a companion you learn to walk beside. And he thought about love, not the grand, sweeping kind, but the daily kind, packing lunches, checking fevers, whispering, "I'm here" in the dark. The music carried all of it. Halfway through, he glanced down at his daughters. His youngest had tears on her cheeks but was smiling. His older one was watching his hands with awe, like she was seeing a part of him she'd always known existed but never got to witness. In that moment, he realized he wasn't playing for the audience. He was playing for them, to show them that even broken hearts can make something beautiful, that sadness and joy can live in the same breath, that their father, though tired and ordinary in so many ways, still carried music inside him, and always would. When the last note faded, the room didn't erupt in applause right away. It held its breath. Then slowly people began to stand, not because they were supposed to, but because they couldn't stay seated. The mayor wiped his eyes. A woman in the back covered her mouth with both hands. Even the camera operators paused just for a second to listen, but he didn't wait for the ovation. He stood, gave a small bow, and walked straight to the edge of the stage. Then he stepped down, not to the wings but into the aisle, and knelt in front of his girls. They threw their arms around him before he could say a word. "You were so good, Daddy," his youngest whispered into his shoulder. "You sounded like the stars," his older one said, voice trembling. He held them tight, breathing in the scent of their hair, shampoo and warmth and childhood. In that hug, all the noise of the night fell away. The cameras, the donors, the headlines, they didn't matter. This did. This messy, imperfect, love-filled life they'd built together out of loss and laundry and lullabies. Later, after the formalities, after the interviews and thank yous and handshakes, he changed back into his regular clothes and took his daughters for hot chocolate at the diner down the street, the one with the cracked vinyl booths and the waitress who always gave extra whipped cream. They talked about the music, about the fancy dresses, about how the piano sounded like home. He listened more than he spoke, soaking in their joy like sunlight after a long winter. Life didn't change overnight after that night. He still woke before dawn to make lunches, still took the bus to work, still swept the same floors, fixed the same leaks, answered the same worried calls from school. But something had shifted, not in his circumstances, but in his spirit. He'd stopped hiding, stopped believing that grief meant silence. Music wasn't a luxury anymore. It was part of his rhythm, like breathing. He started teaching piano at the community center on Saturday mornings, not for money, though they insisted on paying him a small stipend, but because he saw himself in those kids. Quiet, unsure, carrying things too heavy for their age. He taught them scales and songs, yes, but also how to listen. To the music, to each other, to the quiet voice inside that says, "You're still here." That means something. Sometimes, after lessons, parents would linger, eyes red, and say, "My husband passed last year," or, "I don't know how to keep going." He never gave advice. Just made tea, sat with them, and sometimes played a few notes, soft, simple, full of space for their pain. He'd learned that healing isn't about fixing. It's about being present. The foundation he'd supported grew. Donations poured in, not just money, but volunteers, counselors, even a retired teacher who started a homework club for kids in the program. He visited sometimes, not as a celebrity, but as a dad who understood. He'd sit in the back, listening to stories, offering a nod or a quiet word. No one expected him to save them. They just needed to know they weren't alone, and he wasn't alone either. His daughters thrived. His older one joined the school choir. His youngest started drawing pictures of pianos and taping them to the fridge. At night, instead of asking for stories, they'd ask, "Will you play something, Daddy?" And he would, on their old upright, keys slightly out of tune, but full of heart. One evening, months later, he was sweeping the evergreen stage again, just like always when his older daughter came to visit after school. She sat in the front row, backpack on her lap, watching him work. When he finished, she walked up and handed him a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "A song I wrote," she said shyly, "for music class. I used the melody you played that night, the one for Mom." He unfolded it. Simple notation, a few lines of lyrics in her careful handwriting. "Even when you're gone, your love still sings in everything he does." He didn't say anything. Just pulled her into a hug, his broom still in one hand, the paper in the other. That night, he played her song on the grand piano, just for her, just once. She sat cross-legged on the stage floor, eyes closed, smiling, just like someone else used to do. He never became famous in the way the world measures fame. No world tours, no album deals, no magazine covers. But in his neighborhood, in that community center, in the hearts of two little girls and the quiet corners of a city that needed reminding, his music mattered. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. And sometimes, late at night, after the girls were asleep and the apartment was still, he'd sit at the old piano and play. Not for anyone, not for anything, just because the music was still there, waiting. And every time his fingers touched the keys, it felt less like remembering and more like coming home. Because the greatest performance wasn't the one on stage under bright lights. It was the one he lived every day, sweeping floors, tying shoes, playing lullabies, showing up. And in that ordinary, stubborn, beautiful act of continuing, he'd already won.